The Manchester Man by Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks. First published in 1876. Narrated by Malc Cowle on behalf of the Northen Grove Publishing Project. Chapter 1. The Flood. When Pliny lost his life and Herculaneum was buried, Manchester was born. Whilst lava and ashes blotted from sight and memory fair and luxurious Roman cities close to the capital, the Roman soldiery of Titus, under their general Agricola, laid the foundations of a distant city, which now competes with the great cities of the world, where now rise forests of tall chimneys, and the hum of whirling spindles spread the dense woods of Arden, and from the clearing in their midst rose the Roman castrum of Mamucium, which has left its name of Castlefield as a memorial to us, but where their summer camp is said to have been pitched, on the airy rock at the confluence of the rivers Irk and Irwell, sacred church and peaceful college have stood for centuries, and only antiquaries can point to Roman possession, or even to the baronial hall, which the Saxon lord perched there for security, and only an antiquary, or a very old inhabitant, can recall Manchester as it was at the close of the last century, and shutting his eyes upon railway arch, station, and esplanade, upon palatine buildings, broad roadways, and river embankments, can see the Irk and the Irwell as they were when the cathedral was the collegiate church, with a diminutive brick wall 3 parts round its ancient graveyard. Then the irregular fronted rows of quaint old houses, which still under the name of Half Street crowd upon 2 sides of the churchyard, with only an intervening strip of a flagged walk between, closed it up on a 3rd side, and shut the river, lying low beneath, from the view, with a huddled mass of still older dwellings, some of which were thrust out of sight and were only to be reached by flights of breakneck steps of rock or stone, and like their hoary fellows creeping down the narrow roadway of Hunt's Bank, overhung the Irwell, and threatened to topple into it some day. The Chatham Hospital or College still looks solidly down on the Irk at the angle of the streams. The old grammar school has been suffered to do the same, and, thanks to the honest workmen who built for our ancestors, the long lines of houses known as Long Millgate are for the most part standing, and on the riverside have resisted the frequent floods of centuries. In 1799 that line was almost unbroken, from the college where it commenced at Hunt's Bank Bridge to Red Bank. The short alley by the town mill called Mill Brow, which led down to the wooden mill bridge, was little more of a gap than those narrow entries or passages which pierced the walls like slits here and there, and offered dark and perilous passage to courts and alleys, trending in steep incline to the very bed of the Irk. The houses themselves had been good originally, and were thus cramped together for defence in perilous times, when experience taught that a narrow gorge was easier held against warlike odds than an open roadway. Ducie Bridge had then no existence, but Tanner's Bridge, no doubt a strong wooden structure like that at Mill Brow, accessible from the street only by one of those narrow steep passages, stood within a few yards of its site, and had a place on old maps so far back as 1650. Its name is expressive and goes to prove that the tannery on the rocky banks of the Irk, behind the houses of Long Millgate, then opposite to the end of Miller's Lane, was a tannery at least a century and a half before old Simon Clegg worked amongst the tan pits and called William Clough master. To this sinuous and picturesque line of houses, the streams with their rocky and precipitous banks will have served in olden times as a natural defensive moat. Indeed, it is noticeable that old Manchester kept pretty much within the angle of its rivers, and in 1799 from one end of Millgate to the other, the dwellers by the waterside looked across the stream on green and undulating uplands, intersected by luxuriant hedgerows, a bleachery at Walker's Croft, and a short terrace of houses near Scotland Bridge, denominated Scotland, being the sole breaks in the verdure. Between the tannery and Scotland Bridge the river makes a sharp bend, and here, at the elbow, another mill with its corresponding dam was situated. The current of the Irk, if not deep, is strong at all times, though kept by its high banks within narrow compass. But when, as is not unseldom the case, there is a sudden flushing of water from the hill country, it rises, stealthily though swiftly, till the stream overtops its banks, washes over low-lying bleached crofts, fields and gardens, mounts foot by foot over the fertile slopes, invades the houses, and like a mountain robber sweeping from his fastness on a peaceful vale, carries his spoil with him, and leaves desolation and wailing behind. Such a flood as this, following a heavy thunderstorm, devastated the valley of the Irk on the 17th of August, 1799. Well was it then for the tannery, and those houses on the bank of the Irk which had their foundations in the solid rock, for the waters surged and roared at their base, and over pleasant meadows, a widespread turbulent sea, with here and there an island of refuge, which the day before had been a lofty mound. The flood of the previous autumn, when a coach and horses had been swept down the Irwell, and men and women were drowned, was as nothing to this. The tannery yard, high as it was above the bed of the Irk, and solid as was its embankment, was threatened with invasion. The surging water roared and beat against its masonry, and licked its coping with frothy tongue and lip, like a hungry giant greedy for fresh food. Men with thick clogs and hide-bound legs, leather gloves and aprons, were hurrying to and fro with harrows and bark boxes for the reception of the valuable hides, which their mates, armed with long-shafted hooks and tongs, were dragging from the pits pell-mell, ere the advancing waters should encroach upon their territory and empty the tan-pits for them. Already the insatiate flood bore testimony to its ruthless greed. Hanks of yarn, pieces of calico, hay, uptorn bushes, planks, chairs, boxes, dog kennels, and hen coops, a shattered chest of drawers, pots and pans, had swept past, swirling and eddying in the flood, which by this time spread like a vast lake over the opposite lands, and had risen within 3 feet of the Arch of Scotland Bridge, and hardly left a trace where the mill dam chafed it commonly. Too busy were the tanners, under the eye of their master, to stretch out hand or hook to arrest the progress of either furniture or livestock, though beehives and hen coops and more than one squealing pig went racing with the current, now rising towards the footway of Tanner's Bridge. Every window of every house upon the lower banks was crowded with anxious heads, for flooded Scotland rose like an island from the watery waste, and their own cellars were fast filling. There had been voices calling to each other from window to window all the morning, but now from window to window, from house to house, rang one reduplicated shriek, which caused many of the busy tanners to quit their work and rush to the water's edge. To their horror, a painted wooden cradle, which had crossed the deeply submerged dam in safety, was floating foot foremost down to destruction, with an infant calmly sleeping in its bed, the very motion of the waters having seemingly lulled it to sounder repose. "Good Lord, it's a child!" exclaimed Simon Clegg, the eldest tanner in the yard. "Lend a hand here, for sake of childer at home." 1/2 dozen hooks and plungers were outstretched, even while he spoke, but the longest was lamentably too short to arrest the approaching cradle in its course, and the unconscious babe seemed doomed. With frantic haste Simon Clegg rushed on to Tanner's Bridge, followed by a boy, and there with hook and plunger they met the cradle as it drifted towards them, afraid of overbalancing it even in their attempt to save. It swerved and almost upset, but Simon dexterously caught his hook within the wooden hood and drew the frail bark and its living freight close to the bridge. The boy and a man named Cooper, lying flat on the bridge, then clutched at it with extended hands, raised it carefully from the turbid water, and drew it safely between the open rails to the footway, amidst the shouts and hurrahs of breathless and excited spectators. The babe was screaming terribly. The shock when the first hook stopped the progress of the cradle had disturbed its dreams, and its little fat arms were stretched out piteously as strange faces looked down upon it instead of the mother's familiar countenance. Wrapping the patchwork quilt around it to keep it from contact with his wet sleeves and apron, Simon, tenderly as a woman, lifted the infant in his rough arms and strove to comfort it, but in vain. His beard of 3 days' growth was as a rasp to its soft skin, and the closer he caressed, the more it screamed. The men from the tannery came crowding round him. "What dost to mean to do with babby?" asked the man Cooper of old Simon. "I'd tak it home to me missus, but th' owd lass is nowt to be taken to, and were as cross as 2 sticks when I only asked for me baggin' to bring to work with me this morning," added he, with rueful remembrance of the scolding wife on his hearth. "Nay, lad, I'll not trust poor child to thy Sally. It'd be like chucking it out at water into t' fire. Hush your bye, babby. I'll just tak it to our Bess, and hoo'll cuddle it up and gi' it summat to suck, till we find its own mammy," answered Simon, leaving the bridge. "Bring the cather along, Jack," to the boy. A cather, of course, was a cradle. "Bess'll want it. We ain't none of that tackle at our place. Hush your bye, babby." But the little thing, missing its natural protector, and half stifled in the swathing quilt, only screamed the louder, and Simon, notwithstanding his kind heart, was truly glad when his daughter Bess, who had witnessed the rescue from their own window, met him at the tannery gate, and relieved him of his struggling charge. "Sithee, Bess, here's a godsend for thee, a poor little babby for thee to tend and be kind to, till them it belongs to come a-seeking for it," said he to the young woman. "But thou mun give it summat better than cow water. It's had too much of that already." "That I will, poor darling," responded she, kissing the babe's velvet cheeks as sensible of a change of nurses, it nestled to her breast. But there'll be sore hearts for this blessed babby somewhere." And she turned up the narrow passage which led at once from the tan yard and the bridge, stilling and soothing the little castaway as adroitly as an experienced nurse. "Now, look thee, lad," Simon remarked to Cooper. "Isna it fair wonderful how that babby taxed our Bess? But it's just her way who has, and there is na fractious child in all our yard but'll be quiet with Bess." Cooper looked after her, nodded an assent, and sighed as if he wished someone in another yard had the same soothing way with her. But the voice of the raging water had not stilled like that of the rescued infant. Back went the 2 men to their task, and worked away with a will to carry hides, bark, and implements to places of security. And as they hurried to and fro with loads on back or barrow, up, inch by inch, foot by foot, the swelling flood rose still higher, till, lapping the footbridge, curling over the embankment, it drove the sturdy tanners back, flung itself into the pits, and in many a swirling eddy washed tan and hair and skins into the common current. Not so much, however, went into its seething cauldron as might have been had the men worked with less vigour, and quick to recognise the value of ready service, Mr. Clough led his drenched and weary workmen to the Skinner's Arms in Long Millgate, and ordered a supply of ale and bread and cheese to be served out to them. At the door of the public house, where he left the workmen to the enjoyment of this impromptu feast, he encountered Simon Clegg. The kind fellow had taken a hasty run to his own tenement, just to see how our Bess and babby get on, and he brought back the intelligence that it was a lad and as good as goold. "Oh, my man, I've been too much occupied to speak to you before," cried Mr. Clough. "I saw you foremost in the rescue of that unfortunate infant, and shall not forget it. Here is a crown for your share in the good deed. I suppose that was the child's mother you gave it to." Simon was a little man, but he drew back with considerable native dignity. "Thank you, maister, all same, but I canna tak brass for just doing me duty. I'd never ha' slept in my bed gin that little un had been drownded, and me looking on like a stump. Nay, that lass were Bess, my wench. We ha' no notion where th' lad's mother is." Mr. Clough would have pressed the money upon him, but Simon put it back with a motion of his hand. "No, sir, I'm a poor man, a very poor man, but I canna tap money for saving a child's life. It's again me conscience. I'll take me share of the bread and cheese and drink your health in a sup o' ale, but I couldna tap that brass if I were deeing." And Simon, giving a scrape with his clog and a duck of his head, meant for a bow, passed his master respectfully, and went clattering up the steps of the Skinner's Arms, leaving the gentleman standing there, and looking after him in mingled astonishment and admiration. Chapter 2. No One Knows. When the scurrying water, thick with sand and mud, and discoloured with dye-stuffs, which floated in brightly tinted patches on its surface, filled the arch of Scotland Bridge, and left only the rails of Tanner's Bridge visible, the inundation reached its climax. But a couple of days elapsed before the flood subsided below the level of the unprotected tannery yard, and until then neither Simon Clegg nor his mates could resume their occupations. There was a good deal of lounging about Long Millgate and the doors of the Queen Anne and Skinner's Arms, of heavily shod men in rough garniture, of thick black hide, armoury against the tan and water, in which their daily bread was steeped. But in all those 2 days, no anxious father, no white-faced mother, had run from street to street and house to house to seek and claim a rescued living child. No, not even when the week had passed, though the story of his miraculous preservation was the theme of conversation at the tea-tables of gentility and in the bar-parlours of taverns, was the gossip of courts and alleys, highways and byways, and though Echo, in the guise of a flying stationer, caught it up and spread it broadcast in catchpenny sheets far beyond the confines of the inundation. This was the more surprising as no dead bodies had been washed down the river, and no lives were reported lost. Had the child no one to care for it, no relative to whom its little life was precious? Had it been abandoned to its fate, a waif, unloved, uncared for? The house in which Simon Clegg lived was situated at the very end of Skinner's Yard, a cul-de-sac, to which the only approach was a dark covered entry not 4 feet wide. The pavement of the yard was natural rock, originally hewn into the broad, flat steps, but then worn with water from the skies and from housewifely pails, and the tramp of countless clogs, to a rugged steep incline, asking wary stepping from the stranger on exploration after nightfall. Gas was of course unknown, but not even an oil lamp lit up the gloom. In the sunken basement a tripe boiler had a number of stone troughs or cisterns for keeping his commodities cool for sale. The 3 rooms of Simon Clegg were situated immediately above these, 2 small bedrooms overlooking the river and pleasant green fields beyond, the wide kitchen window having no broader range of prospect than the dreary and not too savoury yard. Even this view was shut out by a batting frame, resembling much a long narrow French bedstead, all the more that on its canvas surface was laid a thick bed of raw, that is undressed, cotton, freckled with seeds and fine bits of husky pod. Bess was a batter, and her business was to turn and beat the clotted mass with stout lithe arms and willow wands, until the fibres loosened, the seeds and specks fell through, and a billowing mass of whitish down lay before her. It was not a healthy occupation. Dust and flue release found their way into the lungs, as well as onto the floor and furniture, and a rosy-cheeked batter was a myth. Machinery does the work now, but this history deals with then. During the week dust lay thick on everything. Even Bessie's hair was fluffy as a bursting cotton pod, in spite of the kerchief tied across it. But on the Saturday, when she had carried her work to Simpson's factory in Miller's Lane, and came back with her wages, broom and duster cleared away the film, wax and brush polished up the old bureau, the pride and glory of their kitchen. The 2 slim iron candlesticks, fender and poker, were burnished bright as steel. The 3-legged round deal table was scrubbed white, and then, mounted on tall pattens, that is overshoes, she set about with mop and pail and a long-handled stone to cleanse the flagged floor from the week's impurities. She had had a good mother, and to the best of her ability Bess tried to follow in her footsteps and fill the vacant place on her father's hearth and in his heart. Her mother had been dead 4 years, and Bess, now close upon 20, had since then lost 2 brothers, and lamented as loss one dearer than a brother. The 2 former by death, the other by the fierce demands of war. She had a pale, interesting face with dark hair and thoughtful, deep grey eyes, and was, if anything, too quiet and staid for her years. But when her face lit up, she had as pleasant a smile upon it as one would wish to see by one's fireside, and not even her dialect could make her voice otherwise than low and gentle. Both her brothers had been considerably younger than herself, and possibly the fact of having stood in loco parentis to them for upwards of 2 years had imparted to her the air of motherliness she possessed. Certain it is that if a child in the yard scalded itself, or cut a finger, or knocked the bark off an angular limb, it went crying to Bessie Clegg in preference to its own mother, and she healed bruises and quarrels with the same balsam, loving sympathy. She was just the one to open her arms and heart to her poor motherless babe, and Simon Clegg knew it. Old Simon, or Old Clegg as he was called, probably because he was graver and more serious than his fellows, and had never changed his master since he grew to manhood, certainly not on account of his age, which trembled on the verge of 50 only. He was a short, somewhat spare man with a face deeply lined by sorrow for the loved ones he had lost, but he had a merry twinkling eye, and was not without a latent vein of humour. The atmosphere of the tannery might have shrivelled his skin, but it had not withered his heart, and when he handed the child he had saved to his daughter, he never stopped to calculate contingencies. The boy, apparently between 2 and 3 months old, was dressed in a long gown of printed linen, had a muslin cap, and an under one of flannel, all neatly made, but neither in make nor material beyond those of a respectable working man's child, and there was not a mark upon anything which could give a clue to its parentage. The painted wooden cradle, which had been to it an ark of safety, was placed in a corner by the fireplace, and an old bottle filled with thin gruel, over the neck of which Bess had tied a loose cap of punctured wash leather, was so adjusted that the little one, deprived of its mother, could lie within and feed itself, whilst Bess industriously pursued her avocations. These were not times for idleness. There had been bread riots the previous winter. Food still was at famine prices, and it was all a poor man could do with the strictest industry and economy to obtain a bare subsistence. So Bess worked away all the harder, because there were times when babydom was imperative and would be nursed. She had put the last garnishing touches to her kitchen on Saturday night, had taken off her wrapper brat, put on a clean blue bedgown, and substituted a white linen cap for the coloured kerchief, when her father, who had been to New Cross Market to make his bargains by himself on this occasion, came into the kitchen, followed by Cooper, who, having helped to save the child, naturally felt an interest in him. The iron porridge pot was on the low fire, and Bess, sifting the oatmeal into the boiling water with the left hand, whilst with the other she beat it swiftly with her porridge stick, was so intent on the preparation of their supper, she did not notice their entrance, until her father, putting his coarse Wigan Market basket down on her white table, bade Cooper come in and take a chair. Instead of taking a chair, the man walked as quietly as his clogs would let him to the cradle, and looked down on the infant sucking vigorously at the delusive bottle. Matt Cooper was the unhappy father of 8, whose maintenance was a sore perplexity to him, and it may be supposed he spoke with authority when he exclaimed, "Why, he touched at pap bottle as naturally as if he'd never had nowt else." And the big man, quite a contrast to Simon, stooped and lifted the babe from the cradle with all the ease of long practice, and dandled it in his arms, saying as he did so, "Let's have a look at little chap. I've not seen colour of his eyes yet." The eyes were grey, so dark they might have passed for black, and there was in them more than the ordinary inquiring gaze of babyhood. "Well, that's a pratty lad, but had there been fowest in all Lancashire, I'd ha' thought thee mammy "And a paid for thee afore this," added he, sitting down and nodding to the child, which crowed in his face. "Ah, one would have reckoned so," assented Bess, without turning round. "What art going to do, Simon, 'twas finding child's kin?" next questioned their visitor. Simon looked puzzled. "Why, I've hardly given it a thought," but the question once started was discussed at some length. Meanwhile the porridge, destined for two, Bess poured into 3 bowls, placing 3 iron spoons beside them with no more ceremony than "You tak a sup, here's Matt." Matt apologised, feeling quite assured there was no more than the 2 could have eaten, but Simon looked hurt, and the porridge was appetising to a hungry man. So he handed the baby to the young woman, took up his spoon, and the broken thread of conversation was renewed at intervals. What they said matters not so much as what they did. The next morning being Sunday, Cooper called for Clegg just as the bells were ringing for church, and the 2, arrayed in their best fustian breeches, long-tailed, deep-cuffed coats, knitted hose, 3-cornered hats and shoes, only kept for Sunday wear, set out to seek the parents of the unclaimed infant, nothing doubting that they were going to carry solace to sorrowing hearts. Their course lay in the same track as the Irk, now pursuing its course as smilingly under the bright August sun, as though its banks were not strewed with wreck and foul with thick offensive mud, and the woeful devastations were none of its doing. There were fewer houses on their route than now, and they kept closely as possible to the course of the river, questioning the various inhabitants as they went along. They had gone through Collyhurst and Blakely without rousing anyone to a thought beyond self-sustained damage or gaining a single item of intelligence, though they made many a detour in quest of it. At a roadside public house close to Middleton, they sat down, parched with heat and thirst, called for a mug of ale each, drew from their pockets thick hunks of brown bread and cheese wrapped in blue and white check handkerchiefs, and while satisfying their hunger, came to the conclusion that no cradle could have drifted safely so far, crossing weirs and mill dams, among uprooted bushes, timber, and household chattels, and that it was best to turn back. In Smedley Vale, where the flood seemed to have done its worst, and where a small cottage close to the river lay in ruins, a knot of people were gathered together, talking and gesticulating, as if in eager controversy. As they approached, they were spied by one of the group. "Here are chaps has found Babby, and wanting to know who it belongs to," cried he, a youth whom they had interrogated early in the day. To tell in brief what Simon and his companion learned by slow degrees, the hapless child was alone in the world, orphaned by a succession of misfortunes. The dilapidated cottage had been for some 15 months the home of its parents. The father, who was understood to have come from Crumpsall with his young wife and her aged mother, had been summoned to attend the deathbed of a brother in Liverpool, and had never been heard of since. The alarm and trouble consequent upon his prolonged absence prostrated the young wife, and caused not only the babe's premature birth, but the mother's death. The care of the child had devolved upon the stricken grandmother, who had brought him up by hand, as Matthew's sagacity had suggested. She was a woman far advanced in years and feeble, but she asked no help from neighbours or parish, though her poverty was apparent. She kept poultry and knitted stockings, and managed to eke out a living somehow, but how, none of those scattered neighbours seemed to know. She had held her head so high, pursued her way so quietly. She had been out in her garden feeding her fowls when the flood came upon them without warning, swept through the open doors of the cottage, and carried cradle and everything else before it, leaving hardly a wall standing. In endeavouring to save the child, she herself got seriously hurt, and was with difficulty rescued, but between grief and fright, bruises and the drenching, the old dame succumbed, and died on the Thursday morning, and had been buried by the parish, from which in life she had proudly kept aloof, that very afternoon, and no one could tell other name she had borne than Nan. Bess sobbed aloud when she heard her father's recital, which lost nothing of its pathos from the homely vernacular in which it was couched. "And what's to be done now?" asked Cooper, as he sat on one of the rush-bottomed chairs sucking the knob of his walking stick as if for an inspiration. "You canna think of keeping child and bread and meal at such a price." "Cannot I? Then I canna think o' owt else. Wouldst ha' me chuck it in river again? What dost thou say, Bess?" turning to his daughter, who had the child on her lap. "Why, the poor little lad's got neither father nor mother, and thou's lost both of thy lads. Maybe it's a godsend, feyther, after all, as you said unto me," and she kissed it tenderly. Wench," interposed Matthew, but she went on without heeding him. "There's babby clothes laid by in lavender in those drawers, as hasn't seen daylight sin' our Joe were a toddler, and they'll just come in handy, and if bread's dear and meal's dear, we mun just ate less on it ourselves, and there'll be more for th' child. He'll pay you back, feyther, I know, when you're too old to work. And I can do bout back, lass. If the orphan's granny were too proud to ask help at parish, I'll be too proud to send a pratty grandchild there." And so, to Matthew Cooper's amazement, it was settled. But the extra labour and self-denial it involved on the part of Bess, neither Matthew nor Simon could estimate. In the midst of the rabid scepticism and republicanism of the period, Simon Clegg was a staunch Church and King man, and as a natural consequence, a stout upholder of their ordinances. Regularly as the bell tolled him for Sunday morning service, he might be seen walking reverently down the aisle of the old church to his place in the free seats, with his neat, cheerful-looking daughter following him sometimes, but not always, so regularly that the stout beadle missed him from his seat the Sunday after the inundation, and meeting him in the churchyard a week later, sought to learn the why and wherefore. The beadle of the church was an important personage in the eyes of Simon Clegg, and somewhat proud of his notice, the little tanner related the incidents of that memorable flood week to his querist, concluding with his adoption of the child. The official ummed and ahed, applauded the act, but shook his powdered head and added sagely that it was a great charge, a very great charge. "Don't you think little un's been baptized?" interrogated the beadle. "I cannot tell. Nobody couldn't tell nowt about child that were any use to anybody. Bess and me han talked it o'er, and we were thinking of bringing it to be christened, to be on safe side like. I reckon it wouldn't do child any harm to be christened twice o'er, and 'twould be like flinging child's soul to our scrat, gin he weren't christened at all. What done you thinking?" The beadle thought pretty much the same as Simon, and it was finally arranged that Simon should present the young foundling for baptism in the course of the week. Chapter 3. How the Reverend Joshua Bruce and Simon Clegg interpreted a Shakespearean text. Manchester had at that date two eccentric clergymen attached to the collegiate church. The one, Parson Gatliff, a fine man, a polished gentleman, an eloquent preacher, but a bon vivant, of whom many odd stories are told. The other, the Reverend Joshua Bruce, a short stumpy man, so like to the old knave of clubs in mourning that the sobriquet of the knave of clubs stuck to him, was a rough, crusted, unpolished black diamond, hasty in temper, harsh in tone, blunt in speech and in the pulpit, but with a true heart beating under the angular external crystals, and he was a good liver of another sort than his colleague. He was the son of a crippled and not too sober shoemaker, who, when the boy's intense desire for learning had attracted the attention and patronage of Parson Ainscough, went to the homes of several of the wealthy denizens of the town to ask for pecuniary aid to send his son Joshua to college. The youth's scholarly attainments had already obtained him an exhibition at the Free Grammar School, which, coupled with the donations obtained by his father and the helping hand of Parson Ainscough, enabled him to keep his terms and to graduate at Brazennose, to become a master in the grammar school in which he had been taught, and a chaplain in the collegiate church. So conscientious was he in the performance of his sacred duties that, albeit he was wont to exercise his calling after a peculiarly rough fashion of his own, he married, christened, buried more people during his ministry than all the other ecclesiastics put together. It was to this Joshua Brooks, few ever thought of prefixing the Reverend in referring to him, that Simon Clegg brought Nan's orphan grandchild to be baptised on Tuesday, the 7th of September, just 3 weeks from the date of his involuntary voyage down the flooded Irk. It had taken the tanner the whole of the week, following his conversation with the beadle, to determine the name he should give the child, and many had been his consultations with Bess on the subject. That very Sunday he had gone home from church full of the matter, and lifting his big old Bible from its post of honour on the top of the bureau, it was his whole library, he sat, after dinner, with his head in his hands and his elbows on the table, debating the momentous question. "You see, Bess," said he, "a name as sticks to one all one's life is noan so small a matter as some folk reckon, and yon's no uncommon child. It isna every day, no, nor every year, that a child is weshed down a river in a cather and saved from very jaws of death, and I'd like to gi' a name as 'ud mak it remember it, and thank God for his merciful preservation all days of his life." After a long pause, during which Bess took the baby from the cradle, tucked a napkin under its chin, and began to feed it with a spoon, he resumed, "You see, Bess, hadna I been Curzon Simon, I might have been a cobbler, or a whitster, or a waver, or aught else. But feyther could read, though he couldna write, and as he were a reed-maker, he taught me my ABC, with crooking up bits of wires he couldna use, into shaps of letters, and when I could spell small words gradely, he taught me to read out of this very book, and I read as Simon a tanner, and nowt 'ud sarve me, but I mun be a tanner too, so thou sees, there's summat in a name after all." Bess suggested that he should be called Noah, because Noah was saved in the ark, but he objected that Noah was an old greybeard with a family, and that he knew the flood was coming, and built the ark himself. He was not taken unawares in his helplessness, like that poor babby. Moses was her next proposition. Bess had learned something of biblical lore at the first Sunday school Manchester could boast, the one in Gun Street, founded by Simeon Newton in 1788. But Simon was not satisfied even with Moses. "You see, Moses were put in th' ark of bulrushes a purpose, and neither thee nor me's a Pharaoh's daughter, and th' little chap's not like to be brought up in a palace." Towards the end of the week he burst into the room. "I have it, lass, I have it. We'n call the lad Irk. Nobody'll have a name like that, and it'll tell its own story, and for th' after name I reckon he mun take ours." Marriages were solemnized in the richly carved choir of the venerable old church, but churchings and baptisms in a large adjoining chapel, and thither Bess, who carried the baby, was ushered, followed by Simon and Matt Cooper, who were to act as its other sponsors. At the door they made way for the entrance of a party of ladies, whom they had seen alight from sedan chairs at the upper gate, where a couple of gentlemen joined them. A nurse followed, with a baby whose christening robe, nearly 2 yards long, was a mass of rich embroidery. The mother herself, a slight, lovely creature, additionally pale and delicate from her late ordeal, wore a long plain-skirted dress of tan-coloured brocaded silk. A lustrous silk scarf, trimmed with costly lace, enveloped her shoulders. Her headdress, a bonnet with a bag crown and Quakerish poke brim, was of the newest fashion, as were the long kid gloves, which covered her arms to the elbows. The party stepped forward as though precedence was theirs of right, even at the church door, heeding not Simon's mannerly withdrawal to let them pass. And the very nurse looked disdainfully at the calico gown of the baby and the round arms of Bess. A woman in a grey duffel cloak and old-fashioned flat broad-brimmed hat tied down over the ears. Is there any thrill, sympathetic or antagonistic, in baby veins, as they thus meet there for the first time on their entrance into the church and the broad path of life? For the first time, but scarcely for the last. Already a goodly crowd of mothers, babies, godfathers and godmothers had assembled, a crowd of all grades judging from their exteriors, for dress had not then ceased to be a criterion, and all ceremonies of this kind were performed in shoals, not singly. The Reverend Joshua Brooks, followed by his clerk, came through the door in the carven screen between the choir and baptismal chapel, and took his place behind the altar rails. And now ensued a scene which some of my readers may think incredible, but which was common enough then and there, and is notoriously true. The width of the altar could scarcely accommodate the number of women waiting to be churched, and the impatient Joshua assisted the apparatus to marshal them to their places with a sharp, "You come here, you kneel there, yon woman's not paid," accompanied by pulls and pushes until the semicircle was filled. But still the shrinking lady and another, unused to jostle with rough crowds, were left standing outside the pale. Impetuous Joshua had begun the service before all was settled. For as much as it had pleased, his quick eye caught the outstanding figures. Abruptly stopping his exordium, he exclaimed in his harsh tones, which seemed to intimidate the lady, "What are you standing there for? Can't you find a place? Make room here," pushing two women apart by the shoulder. "Thrutch up closer there. Make haste, and kneel here," to the lady, pulling her forward. "You come here. Make room, will you?" And having pulled and pushed them into place, he resumed the service. Presently there was another outburst. There had been a hushing of whimpering babies and a maternal smothering of infantile cries as a chorus throughout, but one fractious little one screamed right out and refused to be comforted. The nervous tremor on that kneeling lady's countenance might have told to whom it belonged, had Joshua been a skilful reader of hearts and faces. His irritable temper got the better of him. He broke off in the midst of the psalm to call out, "Stop that crying child!" The crying child did not stop. In the midst of another verse he bawled, "Give that screaming babby a breast!" He went on. The clerk had announced the Amen at the end of the psalm. The chaplain followed, "Let us pray." But before he began the prayer, he again shouted, "Take that squalling babby out!" An order the indignant nurse precipitately obeyed, and the service ended without further interruption. Then followed the christenings, and another marshalling, this time of godfathers and godmothers, with the infants they presented, in which the hasty chaplain did his part with hands and voice, until all were arranged to his satisfaction. It so happened that the Tanners group and the ladies group were ranked side by side. The latter was Mrs. Aspinall, the wife of a wealthy cotton merchant, who, with two other gentlemen and a lady, stood behind her, and this time gave her their much-needed support. Indeed, what with the damp and chilliness of the church, and the agitation, the delicate lady appeared ready to faint. "Hath this child been already baptized, or no?" asked Joshua Brooks, and was passing on when Simon's unexpected response arrested him. "I dunno know." "Don't know? How's that? What are you here for?" were questions huddled one on the other, in a broader vernacular than I have thought well to put in the mouth of a man so deeply learned. "Why, you say this is a child as were washed down river with flood in a cather, and all belonging lad are dead, and I'm uncursing him to make ashore." Joshua listened with more patience than might have been expected from him, and passed on with a mere to ask the same question from each in succession, before proceeding with the general service. At length he came to the naming of several infants. Henrietta Bedelia Fitzbourne was given as the proposed name of a girl of middle-class parents. "Mary, I baptize thee," etc., he calmly proceeded, handed the baby back to the astonished godmother, and passed to the next, regardless of appeal. Mrs. Aspinall's boy took his name of Lawrence with a noisy protest against the sprinkling. Nor was the foundling silent. When, having been duly informed that the boy's name was to be Irk, self-willed Joshua deliberately, and with scarcely a visible pause, went on, "Jabus, I baptize thee in the name," etc., and so overturned at one fell swoop all Simon's carefully constructed castle. Simon attempted to remonstrate, but Joshua Brooks had another infant in his arms, and was deaf to all but his own business. Such a substitution of names was too common a practice of his to disturb him in the least, But Simon had a brave spirit and stood no more in awe of Joshua Bruce, Jotty as he was called, than of another man. When the others had gone in a crowd to the vestry to register the baptisms, he stopped to confront the parson as he left the altar. "What right had you to change the name I chose to give that child?" "What right had you to saddle the poor lad with an irksome name like that?" was the quick rejoinder. "Right? Why, I wanted to give the lad a name as should mak him thankful for being saved from drownding to the last days of his life. An irksome name like that would have made him the butt of every little imp in the gutters, until he'd have been ready to drown himself to get rid of it. Jabez is an honourable name, man. You go home and look through your Bible till you find it." Simon was open to conviction. His bright eyes twinkled as a new light dawned upon them. The gruff chaplain had brushed past him on his way to the robing room, but he turned back, with his right hand in his breeches pocket, and put a 7-shilling piece in the palm of the tanner, saying, "Here's something towards the christening feast, that little chap I've stood godfather to, and don't you forget to look in Chronicles for Jabez, and above all, say that the lad doesn't disgrace his name." Joshua Bruce had the character, amongst those who knew him least, of loving money overmuch, and this unwonted exhibition of generosity took Simon's breath. The chaplain was gone before he recovered from his amazement, gone with a tender heart softened towards the fatherless child thrown upon the world, his cynicism rebuked by the true charity of the poor tanner, who had taken the foundling to his home in a season of woeful dearth. And to his credit be it said, the Reverend Joshua Bruce never lost sight of either Simon or little Jabez. He was wont to throw out words which he meant to be in season, but his harsh, abrupt manner, as a rule, neutralized the effect of his impromptu teachings. Now, however, the seed was thrown in other ground, and as he intended, Simon's curiosity was excited. The Bible was reverently lifted from the bureau as soon as they reached home, and after some seeking, the passage was found. Simon's reading was nothing to boast of, but Cooper could not read at all, and in the eyes of his unlettered comrades, Clegg shone as a learned man. He could decipher black print, and that, in his days amongst his class, was a distinction. Slowly he traced his fingers along the lines for his own information, and then, still more slowly, with a sort of rest after every word, read out to his auditors, Bess, Matthew, and Matthew's wife, there in her best gown and best temper, with slight dialectical peculiarities which need not be reproduced. And Jabez was more honourable than his brethren, and his mother called his name Jabez, because she bore him with sorrow. And Jabez called on the God of Israel, saying, "Oh, that thou wouldst bless me indeed, and enlarge my coast, and that thine hand might be with me, and that thou wouldst keep me from evil, that it may not grieve me." And God granted him that which he requested. Simon, mon, how Jotty were wiser nor thee. There's a name for a lad to stand by. It's as good as a leaping power, that it is, to help him up brooks and rooks at world. Simon sat lost in thought. At length he raised his head and remarked soberly, "Parson Bruce might have been a prophet. Chalk's mother did bear him with sorrow. The name fits the lad as if it had been made for him." "Then I hope he's a prophet out, feyther, and all the rest'll come true in time," briskly interjected Bess, adding, "Come, tay's ready." Further appending for the information of their visitors, Madam Clough sent tay and sugar, and big currant loaf, when who heard as feyther had asked for a holiday for kirstening, and Mester Clough sent some yale and a thumping piece of beef. "Aye, lass, and as we are all ready a fine kirstening feast, we are no change parson's 7-shilling piece, but lay it up for laddie sen." But the christening feast did not proceed without sundry noisy demonstrations from Master Jabez. If, as Simon had once hinted, he was an angel in the house, he flapped his wings and blew his trumpet pretty noisily at times. Lass, I wish Tom were here now to enjoy himself with us. I wonder what he'd say to you nursing a babby so bonnily." Simon was munching a huge piece of currant cake as he uttered this. After a meditative pause, a look of pain passed over Bessie's face. She rarely mentioned the absent Tom, though he was seldom out of her thoughts. "Yeah, and I wish he were here," she echoed with a sigh, the fountain of which was deep in her own breast. "I wonder where he is now." "Fighting, mebbe," suggested her father. "Killed, mebbe," was the fearful suggestion of her own heart, and she was silent for some time afterwards. But the feast proceeded merrily for all that, and no wonder where Charity was president, and there was quite as happy a party under that humble roof in Skinner's Yard as that assembled in the grand house at Hardwick, where Master Lawrence Aspinall was handed about in his embroidered robes for the inspection of guests who cared very little about him, although they did present him with silver mugs and spoons and corals, and protest to his pale and exhausted mamma that he was the finest infant in Manchester. Chapter 4. Mischief. It was a time of distress at home and war abroad. Glory's scarlet fever was as rife an epidemic in Manchester as elsewhere. The town bristled with bayonets, corps of volunteers in showy uniforms on parade or exercise, with banners flying, dotted it like spots on a peacock's tail. The music of drum and fife drowned the murmurs of discontented men, the groans of poverty-stricken women, and the cries of famishing children. All nostrums were prescribed for the evils of famine, except a stoppage of the war. The rich made sacrifices for the poor. Pastry was banished by common consent from the tables of the wealthy in order to cheapen flour. Soup kitchens were established for the poor, and in the midst of the general dearth, the 19th century struggled into existence. It was this war fever which had carried off Bessie Clegg's sweetheart, Thomas Hume, to Ireland in Lord Wilton's regiment of Lancashire Volunteers 3 years before. The honest, true-hearted fellow could not write for himself. Postage was expensive and uncertain, and in all those 3 years only 2 letters written by a comrade had reached the girl. To her simple, uninformed mind, Ireland was as foreign and distant a country as Australia is to us in these days, and to be stationed there, with his regiment amongst those wild Irishmen, conveyed only the idea of battles and bloodshed. Yet she kept a brave heart on the matter, and hid her anxieties from her father as well as she was able. In some respects little Jabez was a godsend to her. The frequent attention he required, combined with her labours at the batting frame and her household duties, tended to distract her mind from the dark picture over which she was so much inclined to brood, and to make her, if anything, more cheerful. Once more the voice which had been silent tuned up in song, for the gratification of the youngster, and in amusing him she insensibly cheered and refreshed herself. Yet as she trilled her quaint ballads or Sabbath school hymns, she little thought her vocalization was to furnish an envious mind with a shaft to wound herself, and the one of all others dearer than herself. Soon after the memorable christening feast, Matthew Cooper and his family had removed, or flitted, as they called it, from Barlow's Yard to Skinner's Yard, and Sally, that peaceful man's termagant wife, was not the most desirable of neighbours. The tea and the currant cake and the beef, on that unusually well-spread board, had filled her with pleasure for the time, but turned to gall and bitterness ere they were digested. Why should the Cleggs be so high in the favour of Mr. and Madam Clough, and her Matt get nothing better than half-a-crown piece? He'd quite as much to do in saving the brat's life as Simon had, and, with such a family, wanted it a fine sight more. So she argued and argued with herself, quite ignoring or blind to the fact that it was not the mere impulse which saved, but the humanity which kept the babe that Mr. Clough recognised and never lost sight of. As Simon grew in favour at the tannery, the more excited grew Sally Cooper, until nothing would do but a removal to the opposite yard, where she could see for herself the goings on of them Cleggs, and once there she contrived to harass Bess by numberless little spiteful acts, as well as by her vituperative tongue. Nor did little Jabez himself escape. Parson Brooks, grumbling loudly at every downward step, found his way to Bess O'Syme's, guided by the quick swishing regular beat of the batting ones. Mrs. Clough, having by ocular demonstration satisfied herself that Bess was a sufficiently notable housewife and a kindly nurse, had replaced the worn-out long-clothes which Jabez inherited from brother Joe by a set of more serviceable and suitable short ones, had, moreover, sent an embrocation to allay Simon's rheumatic pains, and to crown the whole, supplied a go-cart for the boy to help him to walk and yet leave the hands of industrious Bess at liberty. As Miss Dewsbury has said in her exquisite story of the rivals, that go-cart was the drop added to the brimming cup, the touch given to the falling column. Maxwell's half, an inveterately clean woman, be it said, was occupied with her Saturday's redding up, that is house-cleaning, when she saw the wood-turner carry it in, and she thereupon trundled her mop at the door so vigorously and viciously that the children instinctively shrank into corners, or ran out of the yard altogether, beyond reach of her weighty arm, and as one by one they ventured back, after what they thought a safe interval, creeping stealthily over the freshly sanded floor, and mayhap leaving the impression of wet clogs thereon, jerks, cuffs, and slaps were administered with a freedom born of her supposed wrongs. When Matt came home to offer his wages upon the household altar, the storm had not subsided, and he was fain to retreat to the quiet fireside of Simon to smoke his pipe in peace and escape its pitiless peltings. He could not have selected a worse haven. It was a flagrant going over to the enemy. Thither she followed him in her wrath, and in her blind fury assailed not only him, but Bess, Simon, Mr. Clough, and Joshua Brooks, whom she mingled in indiscriminate confusion, casting aspersions on the girl, which wounded nobody more than her own husband. In the midst, and in spite of all this, Jabez grew apace. Life was not altogether sweetened for him by Mrs. Clough's kindness, only made a little less bitter, and certainly not less hard, since almost his first experience with the go-cart was to tilt it at the open doorway and pitch head foremost down a flight of 3 steps into the stony yard, whence frightened Bess raised him with a bleeding nose and a great lump on his forehead, amidst the mocking laughter of Sal Cooper. A chair was overturned across the doorway as a barrier until Simon could place a sliding footboard there, but Jabez had still many a knock against chair or table until Bess made a padded roll for his forehead as a protective coronal. Then every tooth cost him a convulsion, and anyone less patient and tender-hearted than Bess would have abandoned her self-imposed charge in despair. His accidents and ailments made such inroads on her rest and on her time. But even patience has its limits, and Sally Cooper strained the cable until it snapped. At a war of words, Bess was no match for her antagonist, and rather than endure a second contest, the Cleggs left the fiery serpent behind and quitted the yard. Not willingly, for Simon, contrary to the roving habits of ordinary weekly tenants, had not changed his abode since his wedding day, and the river was as a friend to him. He declared he couldna sleep o' nights without water singing to him. However, he contrived to find a very similar tenement in just such another cul-de-sac, with just such another tripe-dresser's cellar underneath, and that too without quitting Long Millgate. Midway between the college and the tannery this court was situated, its narrow mouth opening to the breezes wafting down Hanover Street. They could still look out on the verdure of Walker's Croft, and the earth laved its stony base as at that same Skinner's Yard, which Simon lived to see demolished. It was May, bright, sunny, perfumed May. The hawthorn hedges on the ridge of the croft were white with scented blossoms, and the Irk, not the muddled stream which improvement is fast shutting out of remembrance, went on its dimpled way, smiling at the promise of the season. The echoes of the May-Day milk cart bells and the flutter of their decorative ribbons were dying out of all but infantile remembrance. The month was more than a fortnight old. It was 1802, and Jabez was almost 3 years old. He was running, or rather scrambling, about the uneven court, gathering strength of limb and lung from their free use, albeit at the cost of dirt on frock and face, and the trouble of washing for Bess. She was singing at her batting frame, not an unusual thing now, for rumour had whispered in her ear that the Lancashire Volunteers were on their onward march. Even as she sang, a stout young fellow in uniform stopped at the narrow entrance of the court, and questioned 2 or 3 gossiping women, who, with arms akimbo, blocked up the passage, if they knew the whereabouts of Simon Clegg the tanner and his daughter Bess. "What, the wench as has the love child?" answered one of the women. "The girl I mean had no child when I saw her last," responded he between his set teeth. "Happen that some time sin, master, or it's not same lass. That's her singing like a throstle or a work at open window." "And that's her child," said another, ending by a lusty call. "Jabez, lad, come hither." Jabez, taught to obey his elders, came at a trot in answer to the woman's call. The volunteer looked down upon him. The child had neither Bess's eyes nor Bess's features, but he heard the voice of Bess, and over the woman's shoulder he caught a glimpse of her face at the distant window. It was Bess, sure enough. Sick at heart, Tom Hume, for it was he, leaned for support against the side of the dark entry. These women but confirmed what he had heard in Skinner's Yard from Matt Cooper's vindictive wife. The deep shadow of the entry hid his change of countenance. Without a condemnatory word, without a step forward towards the girl, whose heart was full of him, he steadied himself and his voice, and mustering courage to say, "No, that's not the lass I want," strode resolutely out of the entry, and bending his steps to the right, turned up Toad Lane, and so on to the 7 Stars in Withy Grove, where he was billeted. He had come back from Ireland full of hope, and this was the end of it. He had been constant, and she was frail. She, whom he had left so pure, had sunk so low, that though she bore the brand of shame, she could sing blithely at her work, unconscious or reckless of her degradation. Tom had only been a hand-loom weaver, and was but a private in his regiment, but he had a soul as constant in love, as sensitive to disgrace, as the proudest officer in the corps. He might have doubted Sally Cooper's artful insinuations, but for the unconscious confirmation of the other women, and the personal testimony of poor little Jabez, the innocent child, born with sorrow by his own dead mother, bringing sorrow to his living maiden foster-mother. The little lispings of the child conveyed no impression to Bess's understanding, but one of the women bawled out to her from the open court, "I say, there's been a volunteer chap asking for a lass named Bess Clegg, but he saw thee from th' entry and said you're not lass he wanted." Her heart gave a great leap, and the blood flushed up to her pale face. Could it be possible that there was another Bess Clegg, of whom a volunteer could be in search? Yet, had that been her Tom, he would have known his Bess again, even after 5, aye, or 20 years. She would know him anywhere, and so all that day and the next, her heart kept in a flutter of expectation and perplexity. She wondered he did not come. The regiment was in town. He surely had not been misled in his inquiries because they had flitted. Yet, in all her thoughts, the grim reality had no place. Her perfect innocence and singleness of heart had never suggested such a possibility to her. The days went by from the 13th to the 22nd, yet he came not. After working hours, Simon tried to hunt him up, but the billeting system and ill-lighted streets set his simple tactics at defiance. On the latter day, Lord Wilton gave a dinner in the quadrangle of the college to the non-commissioned officers and privates in his regiment, to celebrate their return and the peace and plenty then restored to the land. At the first sound of fife and drum, Bess snatched up Jabez and, leaving house and batting frame to take care of themselves, rushed along the street to the Sun Inn corner, where Long Millgate turns at a sharp angle, the old grammar school and the Chatham College gate standing at the outer bend of the elbow. The better to see, she mounted the steps of the house next to the Sun, a house kept by a leather breeches maker, and strained her eyes as the gay procession wound from the apple market past the handsome black and white frame house of the grammar school's headmaster, and, with banners flying and drums beating, marched under the ancient arched gateway between a double row of blue-coat boys. She held Jabez high up in her arms to let him see, and his little arms clasped her neck as she scanned every passing soldier's features. 2/3 of the corps had passed. She saw the loved and looked-for face, and, radiant with delight, stretched forward, and in eager tones called, "Tom!" There was a mutual start at recognition, 2 faces crimson to the brow, then one white as ashes, a keen, meaning glance at the child, teeth clenched and eyes set with stern resolution, and, without another look, without a word, Tom Hume went on under the whale's jawbone gateway, and Bess, with brain bewildered, hands and limbs relaxed, sank on the breeches maker's steps in a dead faint. A lady, Mrs. Chadwick by name, who had a little girl by the hand, caught Jabez as they fell, and putting his hand in her daughter's, bade her take care of him. She was perhaps a year or 2 older than he, while she raised the poor young woman's head and applied a smelling bottle to her nose. Strange parting, strange meeting, how close the founts of sweet and bitter waters lie, how often separate streams of life meet and part again, some to meet and blend in after years, some to meet never more. Another week, and Lord Wilton's Lancashire Volunteer Regiment had a man the less, the line had a man the more. Private Thomas Hume had exchanged